Dopamine myths. You have probably heard phrases like dopamine detox, dopamine addiction, or dopamine is the pleasure chemical. These ideas are everywhere. They appear in social media posts, self-help advice, productivity videos, and popular neuroscience explanations. But here is the key point. Dopamine is not actually about pleasure. In fact, misunderstanding dopamine leads to confusion about motivation, habits, addiction, burnout, and even why people chase things that no longer make them happy. So let's break the dopamine myth apart, step by step. The popular myth goes like this. Dopamine causes pleasure and happiness. The logic seems simple. You eat chocolate, and dopamine is released. You scroll social media, and dopamine is released. You win a game, and dopamine is released. So people conclude that dopamine equals pleasure. This explanation feels intuitive, which is why it spreads so easily. But he's wrong. Pleasure and dopamine are not the same thing. They often happen together, but together does not mean identical. If dopamine truly caused pleasure, then blocking dopamine would remove pleasure entirely, and increasing dopamine would always increase happiness. Neither of those things is true. So what does dopamine actually do? And neither of those things is about motivation, dopamine, and creating, and prediction. Dopamine helps the brain answer questions like, is this worth pursuing? Should I put effort into this? Did this turn out better or worse than expected? Instead of saying this feels good, dopamine says something different. It says, pay attention, this matters. Dopamine assigns importance. Psychologists call this salience. That means dopamine is especially active before an action, during anticipation, and when outcomes are uncertain. It is not primarily about enjoyment itself. One of the most important ideas in neuroscience is something called reward prediction error. Dopamine neurons respond most strongly when something is better than expected, or when a reward is unexpected. Here is an example. Imagine buying a lottery ticket. Before the draw, dopamine activity rises because of anticipation. If you lose, dopamine activity drops because the outcome is worse than hoped. If you win unexpectedly, dopamine spikes dramatically. Now compare that to something predictable. The first bite of a favorite dessert produces a strong dopamine response. The 10th bite produces a much smaller one. Why? Because your brain already predicted it. Dopamine is sensitive to surprise, not pleasure. When a reward becomes fully expected, dopamine activity fades, even if the experience is still enjoyable. This leads to a crucial distinction in neuroscience. Wanting is not the same as liking. Liking refers to the feeling of pleasure itself. It is linked more closely to opioid and endocannabinoid systems. Wanting refers to craving, motivation, and the urge to pursue something. This is strongly linked to dopamine. You can have high wanting with low liking, or liking without strong wanting. This explains a very common experience, wanting something more than you actually enjoy it. For example, opening an app, scrolling for several minutes, and then wondering why you were still doing it. That is dopamine-driven wanting, without much pleasure. This misunderstanding becomes especially serious when people talk about addiction. Addiction is often described as too much pleasure, but that is not accurate. In addiction, dopamine systems become sensitized. Cues trigger intense wanting. At the same time, pleasure often declines. This is why cravings increase, while satisfaction decreases. People do not continue addictive behaviors because they feel amazing. They continue because dopamine has taught the brain that this behavior is extremely important and must be pursued. Addiction is not a pleasure problem. It is a learning and motivation problem. Another common myth is that dopamine equals happiness. You can have high dopamine, high drive, and high productivity, and still feel stressed, empty, or burned out. Dopamine helps you chase goals. It does not guarantee satisfaction when you reach them. This is why achievements can feel strangely hollow, and success does not automatically bring contentment. Dopamine pushes behavior. It does not define well-being. This brings us to the idea of dopamine detoxes. The claim is that modern life overstimulates dopamine, and that avoiding pleasure will reset the brain. But dopamine does not get used up. It does not need cleansing, and it is constantly regulated by the brain. Avoiding pleasure does not fix dopamine systems. What actually matters are habits, expectations, and learned reward patterns. It is not about removing dopamine. It is about changing what your brain learns to pursue. So here is the takeaway. Dopamine is not the pleasure chemical. It is a motivation signal. It is a learning system. It is a prediction tracker. Dopamine tells your brain, this is worth chasing. And sometimes, that signal keeps firing, even when enjoyment fades. Understanding dopamine does not just correct a myth. It explains habits, addiction, burnout, and modern distraction. And once you understand dopamine clearly, you start to understand your own behavior in a very different way.
If you enjoyed our channel, please click subscribe.